Penn State On Demand is a service of Penn State Public Broadcasting, and now you can support WPSU when you shop online. Visit WPSU.org/shop to make purchases from national online retailers, and WPSU will receive a portion of the sale with no extra cost to you. So start your online shopping at WPSU.org/shop.
Presentation of To the Best of My Knowledge on WPSU is made possible in part by support from the Penn State Alumni Association, informing, involving, and inspiring Penn State alumni and students through its publications, programs, and events. On the web at alumni.psu.edu. And from the members of WPSU.
From the studios of Penn State Public Broadcasting, this is To the Best of My Knowledge. Good evening, I'm Graham Spanier. Tonight we'll talk about terrorism. More than 8 years after the attacks on September 11, 2001, terrorism still dominates U.S. security concerns. Today we're seeing a new face of terrorism emerge with recent events at home and abroad. What drives individuals to support terrorist movements? What do they hope to achieve? Tonight we'll discuss terrorism. We'll also take your phone calls at 1-800-543-8242, and you can email your questions to response@psu.edu. And now let's meet our guests. Jan Fedarcyk is the special agent in charge of the FBI's Philadelphia field office. She was instrumental in leading the development of a classified National Strategic Operational Plan in the war on terrorism. John Horgan is the director of the International Center for the Study of Terrorism, which is based at Penn State. His research examines many aspects of terrorism and has recently focused on disengagement from terrorist movements. Thank you both for being here on our program tonight.
Pleasure.
Well, let's start with the basics. John, could you tell us what is terrorism? Do you have a definition for us?
We have lots of definitions. I think the problem is we don't seem to be able to agree on any of those definitions. At last count, there were at least 109 official definitions used by policymakers and agencies around the world. And that doesn't include the additional 300 definitions or so in the academic literature. But generally speaking, the most consensus that exists on the definition of terrorism is that it is the use or the threat of use of violent behavior to effect some kind of political change. For the most part, we associate terrorism with non-state actors. That is not to say that states don't engage sometimes in what could be classified as terrorist activity, but for the most part, it's non-state activity. Mm-hmm. Victim qualities also tend to be very central in terms of what we classify or define as terrorism. So civilian casualties will inevitably have a group labeled as terroristic in nature.
And Jan, from the perspective of the FBI, how do you view it?
Well, as John has mentioned, of course, there are many definitions of terrorism. We view it from the context of the Code of Federal Regulations, which carries many of the same requirements, if you will, as some of the more academic definitions. It involves the unlawful use of force or violence against citizenry or governments to effect political or social change.
And let me just ask both of you to talk a little bit about how terrorism fits into armed political or social action.
Well, one of the reasons I think as to why terrorism is such an attractive strategy for many kinds of disaffected groups is that it is effective both in the short term as well as in the long term. Terrorists seem to be very good at getting our attention. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, once described the media as being the oxygen of publicity for the terrorists. Mm-hmm. The immediate objective of any terrorist event is to terrorize, it's to destabilize us, to make us feel uncomfortable in the daily routines, the daily kinds of things we take for granted, to try to instill fear and uncertainty in terms of little things like getting on a plane or being at the top of a skyscraper. There is a big difference, however, between the kinds of things that terrorists want to achieve and the things that they are able to achieve. So while they may be very successful in the short term, terrorism as a long-term strategy doesn't prove to be very effective.
When we talk about terrorism, it's natural for a lot of people to think about people from elsewhere in the world, but we have domestic terrorism as well, and that's a big focus for the FBI also.
Yes, it is. And from the FBI's perspective, when we talk about terrorism, we talk about either international terrorism or domestic terrorism. Those domestic terrorism groups typically have no foreign connection or nexus. They are based here in the United States. Their activities are in the United States. They can be members of domestic groups, or they can be what we would classify as a lone wolf terrorist.
Mm-hmm. And in universities across the country, there's concern about animal rights terrorism and eco-terrorism. We see a fair amount of that out west, and many very prominent research universities have had incidents there. So that all falls within your purview in the FBI also.
Yes, it does. And having come from Los Angeles, where there were terrorist activities, domestic terrorist activities taken against some of the universities in Southern California, predominantly it was directed towards those academic institutions that were engaging in research that used animals in that research, and the professors that were involved in that type of activity.
So what do terrorists hope to achieve anyway? What are they after?
Well, most terrorist groups are essentially after the destabilization or overthrow of some kind of regime. Now, in reality, that's a very difficult thing to do. I think the best that they can hope to do is to usurp the democratic political process, to try to influence an audience in ways that they typically can't otherwise influence. And this is one of the ways in which terrorism is a distinct kind of warfare as opposed to, for example, assassination, whereby there is one very specific kind of target. It's almost like a war by proxy, killing civilians to send a message to a much broader target, which for the most part is the government.
Now, the FBI has arrested terrorists along the way, and have you ever had a chance to gain some insight? I mean, has anyone you've arrested leveled with you and you've come away saying, oh, I never really thought about it that way?
Well, the FBI is always interested in motivations, and from a behavioral standpoint, clearly we are interested in characteristics that would help us potentially identify trends and patterns. We believe that if we study those characteristics, that oftentimes behavior will be a predictor of future behavior, and to the extent that we have qualified experts looking at those types of characteristics, we're always interested in trying to delve down into the psyche of individuals who have been arrested on terrorism charges.
If you're just joining us, I'm Graham Spanier, president of Penn State, and this is To the Best of My Knowledge on WPSU. That's Penn State Public Broadcasting. Our topic tonight is terrorism with guests Jan Fedarcyk, Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Philadelphia Field Office, and John Horgan, Director of the International Center for the Study of Terrorism at Penn State. You can join the conversation by calling us at 1-800-543-8242 or email us at response@psu.edu. Let's open up the phone lines now and take our first call. It's from Gary, who's calling from Stormstown. Gary, thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Hello, Dr. Spanier. This is a two-part question that can be addressed by all three of you.
Okay.
Dr. Horgan, as the director for the Penn State International Center for the Study of Terrorism, your research takes you to many countries and through many airport security checks. Can you compare the security checks in U.S. airports to those in Europe or Asia? Please offer both the good and bad in each system. The second part of the question
But Gary,
is...
hang on for a minute. Let's do that first, and then we'll come back to you with the next question.
That's a very, thank you very much, Gary, for your question. I think certainly I wouldn't want to be too critical of what the kind of task that the TSA has in front of it in this country. I think emotions are still running quite raw still after the events surrounding the Christmas Day attempted bombing by Omar Farouk al-Abdul Muttalib. There certainly have been some pretty serious shortcomings that have been revealed in some of the European systems. It's probably premature and a little bit too early to say what specifically led to him being able to smuggle explosives through those airports, so the jury is very much still out on that. To my knowledge, there is no publicly available systematic survey of the strengths and weaknesses to allow us to be able to compare what might be more effective in one jurisdiction as opposed to another.
And Gary, your second question?
He almost answered that. Based upon your experiences in U.S. and international airports, in short, could you offer several best practices that could be uniformly used by both systems that you feel might improve the security measures offered in both countries?
That's quite a question. I think based on my own experiences, I mean, I think the staff here at the State College Airport know me on a first-name basis right now because I travel so much. Just like any other traveler, I have to take off my shoes and I have to take my things out of my bags and suffer the kinds of short-term issues that we all have to face. Beyond that, I really can't give you advice on best practice because, to my knowledge, that study does not exist.
And Jan, how about from your perspective?
Well, from our perspective, of course, security at the airport is the purview of the Transportation and Security Agency, the TSA. We work very closely with them as part of our efforts with the Joint Terrorism Task Forces should an incident occur on an airline. And so ours is more of a response and investigative capability in terms of working closely with our partners for transportation security, of course. We do that through the venue of the Joint Terrorism Task Force.
And how does that work? If there is an incident at the airport, are you called and do you have to dispatch folks, for example, to the Philadelphia airport or other major airports within this area of the United States?
Absolutely, and in fact, in Philadelphia, we have recently assigned an agent there full-time as part of our airport liaison effort. If there were to be an incident at the airport, and we have had several over the past number of months, we have had a very integrated Joint Terrorism Task Force response to investigate those particular complaints.
And could you describe what the Joint Terrorism Task Force is and how that works around the country, not just in your area, but what is the structure of that effort?
Absolutely. Joint Terrorism Task Forces are basically interagency in nature. They work under the guidelines and rules of the FBI, but everyone is co-located in one space. And we investigate tips and leads that come in, as well as more long-term terrorism-related investigations. And we do that by leveraging the equities and the background and the capabilities of all of the different agencies, be they local, state, or other federal agencies that are on board with the JTTFs. And those are nationwide. We have roughly 100 right now across the country.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth adding as well that there is tremendous psychological prestige among and between terrorist groups to be able to penetrate airport security. This is why we can't ever afford to be complacent and to ever allow the kinds of things we saw happen on Christmas Day to happen again. The plot that was uncovered in London to attempt to smuggle liquid chemical explosives on board a transatlantic airliner, the reality is that that kind of thing is very, very difficult to do. For most terrorist groups around the world, it isn't that difficult to kill lots and lots of people. So it begs the very basic question, why on earth would they try to penetrate Heathrow airport security, where traditionally they have been the bastion of frontline defenses against terrorist activity? The answer is that this is something that is tried time and time again by terrorist groups, and it has such enormous psychological power that it will be tried again.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've gotten to know a number of terrorists and former terrorists as part of your research, as to kind of get to know them, to get inside their heads, and to find out why they become terrorists and why they stop. Can you give us a little insight into what you've learned?
Absolutely. Well, there's often talk about attempts to try to find a profile of a terrorist. You alluded to that earlier. The unfortunate reality is that 40 years of research in academia hasn't yet revealed a terrorist profile. Now, the academic community is pretty much divided into two camps. There's one group of academics who believe that the only reason we haven't found a terrorist profile is because we haven't been able to, for example, access a mythical FBI database where if we were able to access it, we might be able to develop these profiles. The other view, of course, is that the reason we haven't found a profile is because it's just not possible. And I put myself very firmly in that. Terrorist groups have become very adept at changing the composition of their members. They are sensitive to the kinds of profiles we have of them. So they will change the composition of operatives to try to remain one step ahead of the curve here. Even those terrorists that we manage to speak to, and it is, I should say for the record, it really is possible for academics to speak safely with former terrorists about their experiences, even those interviewees that are cooperative with us will themselves find it difficult to explain the complexity of the choices they made in terms of becoming involved in terrorism.
So, Jan, do you have some database that if John and a few of his academic buddies could get a hold of, they'd figure this all out?
No, we don't. No, we don't. And we work very closely from our behavioral analysis units down at Quantico with Dr. Horgan, and that's been a very successful partnership. Clearly, there's no one answer to this puzzle.
What insights can you give us into the thinking of terrorists that are operating within the U.S. or trying to come into the U.S.? Is there anything in particular that in your experience we ought to be looking at more closely?
Well, I think that what we see is, as Dr. Horgan mentioned earlier, a return to tried and true practices that have been used in past attacks. I think also some of the trend that we are starting to see involves a movement away from more large-scale attacks to smaller and more, not only smaller in scope, but smaller in numbers to try and hit as quickly and in as many different areas as possible. So it is a changing and evolving strategy, and we have to be quick enough in our response to be able to counter those efforts.
And is the media an ally for you, or does it drive you crazy having the media around? Because, of course, once there's been a terrorist act and you're after somebody, it's kind of too late. A lot of what you're doing is counterterrorism. You're trying to head it off. You're trying to find people before they do something that, and the FBI's had many successes. A lot of them have not been publicized, and some have been, some have been leaked out. The public probably is thirsty for more information about this, but I imagine you have to sort through what you can say and how much you say and things you hope never come out because it would interfere with what you're trying to do.
Well, the whole goal here is prevention of an act of terrorism, and so by the time an act of terrorism occurs, we're definitely in the response mode. So our goal is really to prevent an act occurring, and so how do we go about doing that? A lot of different mechanisms are in place. We would call them tripwires, intelligence sharing, information sharing, trying to make sure that we are out in front of the information coming into a lot of disparate areas, trying to connect up those dots and make sure that we hold that net as tightly as we can to prevent an act of terrorism occurring. To the extent that there are many such activities taking place and we are preventing acts of terrorism, you're absolutely correct. Many of those types of situations will never come to the awareness of the general public. However, it's a very robust and ongoing effort that we cannot afford to take our eye off that ball.
Now, on the internet, Colleen LaRose, I think was her name, was known as Jihad Jane, a petite 46-year-old from the suburbs of Philadelphia. Does she represent a potential new face of terrorism? And has the traditional profile of a terrorist changed?
That's a very good question, and I think you've touched on something that's giving us all quite significant pause for concern. I was speaking with one of my postdoc researchers, Paul Gill, about this the other day, and he commented to me as I was leaving. He said, well, when did we ever have a traditional profile of a terrorist? And I think he's right. I don't think we've ever really had a traditional profile. Colleen LaRose certainly is part of an ongoing investigation, and there appears to be several international strands to that which haven't been fully fleshed out yet. So there's very much an investigation in progress. What we know, which is purely from what we can glean from media coverage, is that she clearly represents something new, something different. The internet has facilitated opportunities and has given rise to new pathways for individuals that might not previously have had access to these kinds of groups to become involved. And one of the ironies, I think, since 9/11 is that the issue of what it means to be involved in terrorism is now something very complex and very, very dynamic.
Let's take a call now from John, who's calling in from Altoona. Hi, John, you're on the air.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Spanier. I was wondering, recently General Petraeus had stated that if we had modified our stance towards Israel and stopped giving them unconditional support, that it would be a positive thing for the troops on the ground and for the overall policy in the Mideast, and probably go a long way towards lessening terrorism in that area. I was wondering what the panelists might have to say about that.
Any thoughts about that comment, or about the concentration of terrorism that we sometimes see coming out of the Middle East?
Well, if I may, that's a very, very good question and a very complex question, and I'll try to give the best answer I can. I genuinely don't believe that a change in that relationship is going to suddenly mean that we have a significant reduction in terrorism. I think one of the things it may lead to, if managed and handled correctly and appropriately, is a way essentially of taking some of the steam out of the kinds of grievances that terrorist groups use to try to justify what it is they do. But I wouldn't be too optimistic that we're going to see the kinds of changes that the General may have alluded to. But that's my own opinion.
If you're just joining us, I'm Graham Spanier, president of Penn State, and this is To the Best of My Knowledge on WPSU, Penn State Public Broadcasting. Our topic tonight is terrorism, with guest Jan Fedarcyk, special agent in charge of the FBI's Philadelphia field office, and John Horgan, director of the International Center for the Study of Terrorism at Penn State. You can join the conversation by calling us at 1-800-543-8242, or email us at response@psu.edu. Jan, under the current and longtime now director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, he reorganized the priorities of the FBI when he came in, and they've held up pretty solidly during his tenure. And right at the top of the list is counterterrorism, then counterintelligence, then cybersecurity, and then a number of the other things that used to be a little more prominent as people remember the history of the FBI. Could you give us a sense, since you oversee this region of the United States and have to deal with all of the priorities and all of the federal crimes that come under the purview of the FBI, how big a piece of what you do and what you worry about is focused on terrorism?
Well, from a Philadelphia division perspective, terrorism remains the number one priority, and we have allocated sufficient numbers of resources to that program such that we've drawn some of our resources away from other traditional areas to make sure that we've got the landscape covered. As I mentioned earlier, with our Joint Terrorism Task Force in place, we force multiply our ability to cover our terrorism responsibilities by leveraging our local, state, and federal partners. It remains at the forefront, particularly as we have seen some of the increased activity in some of our recent cases in Philadelphia, which have been highlighted through the media. It is definitely an area of great concern, and we do maintain a very robust program to tackle those very difficult issues.
when you have something developing that seems unusually big or important, do you have the ability to call in the troops, so to speak? Do you call FBI headquarters in Washington and say, we're going to need more help for this, and people come running and load up on the resources in the Philadelphia area to deal with an issue?
We will always try to handle a terrorism-related matter in our territory with our resources, and if that means that we have to reallocate them from other areas, we will do that. We have done that. We've had a number of last-minute situations that have come up, if you will, after hours, over weekend timeframes, and so what we have very adeptly done has been to take resources from other program areas and to surge them into wherever we need them. And as you would expect, everybody in the Philadelphia division, all of the employees there, regardless of which program they're working, understand that when the need arises, they are and will be responsive to the need to address terrorism-related matters.
From what you see, is this getting better or worse for us in the U.S.? Are you having to work harder in this area, and should we all be more vigilant, or do we see that it's slowing down?
Well, from my perspective in Philadelphia, I see the uptick in activity, particularly the concern that we talked about earlier with the lone wolf, the self-radicalized individuals that are going on to the internet and buying into that philosophy and moving themselves along that pathway to conversion to something greater. I think that that activity is increasing, not decreasing, particularly, as I say, from a domestic front. We have certainly had our share of international terrorism investigations in Philadelphia, and we recognize that we're in a time of increased tempo and maintaining our resources and our ability to respond very effectively, and to make sure that as best we can to keep those defenses and the tripwires up, to make sure that we are on the front end of preventing an act as opposed to the back end where we're investigating it.
And to add to that, I think alert but not alarmed is a mantra that has gone down very well in the UK. We cannot live on a knife edge of terror. I mean, fortunately, the reality is such that it's very difficult to terrorize people, and communities and groups and all of us that are in some way affected by this problem adapt very quickly. We're all resilient, and we find ways of building resilience. And so it is not the life or death situation that we constantly are led to believe by some of the more sort of scaremongering accounts of what terrorists might be able to do to us.
Talk to us about the role of religion and culture in the whole terrorism phenomenon.
I think the role of religion, I think, has been overstated in some quarters. The evidence from the research, from some of the really good research that's coming out from the academic community right now, seems actually to be suggesting that religion is something that recruits to jihadist movements in particular acquire only once they become involved. They're not religious at the time of joining the jihad, but they acquire religious ideology as a byproduct of involvement. Much has been said about so-called sort of at-risk communities and cultures that from the outside look as if they glorify martyrdom or glorify dying for a particular cause. I think that's been overstated. The true player here, if you like, is the terrorist organization that does its very best to sell and foster a culture of martyrdom and places a prestige upon particular roles such that people want to become involved. They're led to believe that they can achieve much more in death than they can ever in life. And religion is very often used as a tool to try to focus that involvement. But this notion of religious terrorism, I think, is misleading and potentially quite troublesome.
I think I've heard you say that it's hard to predict who will become a terrorist. It can be, most anybody, but surely there must be some common characteristics. There must be something out there that we could latch onto and say, that's a sign of possibly heading in that direction.
Well, we certainly have made some progress in identifying some of the kinds of push and pull factors that appear to be common across members, not just within specific terrorist movements, but even across the board. But these tend to be quite broad. The push factors tend to be some of the big social and political issues that create radical views, whether it is the victimization of a community or perceived humiliation or something like that. The pull factors are much more specific to the group in question. They relate to things like the sense of what it might mean to be involved, the sense of camaraderie, adventure, excitement, all of the kinds of things that really serve to contribute to the allure of what it means to be involved in terrorist groups.
And any characteristics that you've spotted as you encounter people who are heading down that road and you've gotten to them ahead of time?
Well, we have identified basically a radicalization process, and the goal for us is to try and intervene at the earliest part of the continuum before somebody conceivably gets to the last phase, which is action. Identifying those characteristics is oftentimes not easy, but in terms of information coming in from the public, oftentimes provides us an early view into somebody that may be exhibiting some of those characteristics that will draw the attention of family members, friends who are voicing, quite frankly, concern over the activities of a loved one.
And the difficulty, of course, is that there are a lot more people that are radicalized than will ever become involved in terrorism.
Right.
Right. Let's take another call now. We have Reed on the line. He's calling from State College. Good evening, Reed.
Thank you. I just was wanting to say that I've been somewhat critical of the war on terrorism because it seems to me it sets a mood in the country which is supportive of, let us say, a more restrictive, or if not militarized state where civil liberties suffer because we're always worried about terrorism. I think that there's a way to work on it in a preventive way, which would be more important. Take, for example, when Martin Luther King was opposing racism or segregation. Now, those were things that some people would call him a terrorist because he had sit-ins and he had lie-ins and he had hunger strikes and he had marches. Some people would call that terrorism. But he was trying to highlight faults in society which needed to be changed. And he had remarkable success, not him alone, many others in the civil rights movement. So I think we have to be careful and not think that we can't do anything about terrorism except catch them. We can do something about terrorism by looking for things in our society about which people are very troubled. In other words, sometimes, I don't know always, sometimes the things which terrorists pick up are things which deserve attention. I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah. Well, Reed started off talking about this always difficult tension between civil liberties and efforts to head off potential terrorism. You know, when we're screening people at the airports, all of us feel like we're giving up some of our freedom there, and taking our shoes off, taking our jackets off, going through metal detectors and scanners and having our luggage looked at. There's some people who I suppose feel that's gone too far, but there may be some others who feel we haven't gone far enough. How do you weigh that balance? I know you have to worry about that all the time, Jan, because there's only so far that you can go without court orders.
That's right. From our perspective, of course, protecting our constitutional freedoms, our civil liberties is paramount. We have to weigh that, I think, with the fact that we live in a very free and open society. It is expected that from an FBI perspective, we will maintain our adherence to our constitutional tenets, and to the extent that those freedoms also provide opportunities for those who would exploit our open society and our openness. It's a very difficult balance, I think, that we struggle with, protecting the public at the same time making sure that we're keeping the public safe and responding accordingly.
Next in the queue is Todd, who's calling from Lock Haven. Hello, Todd.
Hello. My question is directed toward Dr. Horgan.
Mm-hmm.
Having spent much time in Northern Ireland, I'm curious to know how he might feel about the historical relationship between the British government and how the British dealt specifically with the provisional IRA, and what the United States might learn from that relationship with regard to how it deals with Al Qaeda. And I'll hang up and listen to this.
Okay, thank you, Todd, for that question. John?
Thank you. Very good question, Todd. I think anyone who has studied the Northern Ireland conflict would probably say that the British government and British policies did an awful lot of harm before that course of action was reversed. Certainly a lot of the policies that were enacted in the 1970s, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the detention of suspects without trial, internment, really did very little more than to fuel the kind of support that the IRA were able to use to galvanize the ranks in their movement. That changed very significantly in the early 1990s when the British government, in conjunction with the Irish government, were very effective in bringing together the warring sides to agree to the first of a series of steps that led to a negotiated settlement, which I have to say have meant that there's been very significant change in Northern Ireland. There are some emerging problems right now. It looks like there is a revitalized and re-energized dissident terrorist movement, and this is something that for the work we're doing at ICST at Penn State, we're watching very, very closely. But this aside, I think there's been very significant progress. I think as far as the lesson learned, some of the lessons learned are concerned, any democratic state that seeks to effectively combat and undermine the kinds of things that terrorists do vis-a-vis support, the state has to hold a moral high ground, because otherwise it simply won't be able to win the hearts and minds of the public. And I think this is an area where the British government found it very, very difficult to win hearts and minds in the early days, but eventually turned things around. And I think that's probably the number one lesson that we can take in terms of the contemporary struggle against movements like Al Qaeda.
Let's take a question that comes via email. I was wondering if your panelists could comment on the recent discovery that David Headley, an American citizen, was involved in the terrorism attacks in Mumbai, India. What information sharing is occurring between the U.S. and India? He believes many Indian Americans are concerned about this situation. How much exchange of information is there between governments and within our own government? A lot of the publicity after 9/11 was about not connecting the dots and the lack of information sharing between the FBI, the CIA, and other agencies. How would you say it's working now?
I would say from the perspective of a post-9/11 environment that we are seeing a tremendous amount of information sharing across not only our domestic law enforcement and intelligence partners, but also with our partners in other countries. And I think that is one of the hallmarks of our success since 9/11 to prevent another major act of terrorism has been the flow of information, the transparency of that information, and collectively everybody has come together, I think, to work in preventing terrorism. And I think we're in a much better posture than we were pre-9/11.
You know, for a long time, the worst attack on American soil was perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh, a white Christian U.S. citizen. We had talked earlier a little bit about homegrown terrorism, but do you study that in your center, and do you see any differences between domestic and international terrorism?
I think there are certainly some differences, but the way in which homegrown terrorism is changing currently in the United States reveals a much more complex picture, and there's a very complex relationship between local events and international events. One issue in particular that we've been looking at very, very closely with colleagues of ours at the University of Illinois at Chicago is the increasing radicalization of some youths that are at risk among the Somali community in Minneapolis. We had the case of Sheru Ahmed 2 years ago, who was recruited and groomed to become a suicide bomber. He was from the Cedar Riverside area of Minneapolis and went to Somalia, where he blew himself up sometime later. There clearly is a community that is at risk. That community is asking for help to such a degree that they actually contacted us at our center with a call for help to say, we need to be able to design a counter-radicalization capacity in our community to protect our young kids from falling under the spell of this movement, the Al-Shabaab movement. Because clearly this movement is able to spin a tale that even the parents and grandparents of these young kids aren't able to counteract.
There's the issue of Mirandizing people here on U.S. soil. We had such an issue recently with Zazi, the Denver area airport shuttle bus driver, who's accused of training with Al-Qaeda to launch an attack against the New York City subway. There's a little debate about it, and where do you stand on it?
Well, the FBI is not a policy-making entity. Clearly, those decisions will be made at more executive levels of the U.S. government. From the standpoint of investigating terrorism domestically, again, as I mentioned earlier, we will always adhere to our constitutional tenets, the rights that attach at the time of an arrest, and that would include the issuance of the Miranda warnings. If at some point we were to be faced by another Christmas Day situation as we were in Detroit, I would envision that other and higher levels of authority in the government might conceivably weigh in on the decision as to whether or not a Miranda would be issued.
Now, within the FBI, we have a terrorist finance tracking program. Terrorist organizations can't really function once they get kind of big and complicated without money, right? Internationally or domestically. So following the money, I suspect, is very important here. Where does the money come from?
Well, I should say, because I think many of the things we're saying certainly makes me sound very, very pessimistic. Fortunately, one good statistic I can give you is that approximately 80% of all terrorist groups die out within a year. And the reason they die out within a year is because they fail to plan ahead. Those groups that do plan ahead and tend to stick around for a long time engage in extensive involvement in organized crime, everything from kidnapping to drug trade to extortion to prostitution, counterfeit goods, you name it.
And for those that have underlying their cause a religious basis with a presumably conservative lifestyle attached, how does that get reconciled, that they're engaged in organized crime-like activities?
They tend to work very hard at it. Something that psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance, which is that you find a way very quickly of reconciling what might on the surface appear to be two completely contradictory stances. The fundraising is always justified as being part of the greater good. It serves the cause, therefore it's not, in their eyes, the same as conventional criminal activity. So it's justified quite easily for them.
There seems to be more terrorism in certain democratic countries, like India, let's say, than in countries like China that aren't as democratic. It's a little counterintuitive, but how is democracy connected to the phenomenon of terrorism flourishing or not?
That's a great question, and that's something that political scientists in particular have spent a long time investigating. There is an assumption that authoritarian regimes are somehow better or more effective at controlling terrorism. I mean, the truth is that they're not. They're certainly no more effective than democratic societies. What authoritarian regimes tend to be better at is stifling dissent from the very early stages, which in some cases, if left to flourish, might give rise to terrorist activity. terrorist groups in operating in authoritarian regimes also find it a lot more difficult to exploit the media for their own means, where you have state-controlled media, for example. So it's a little bit more complex than might appear on the surface.
Now, taking this down from the 10,000-foot level right to the ground level, you know, there are people who will call 911 if their cat's stuck up in a tree, but they would be afraid, I presume, to call the FBI and say, you know, there's just something going on here that I want to tell somebody about. Could you give us a little primer on how afraid or unafraid people should be to call the FBI? And what kinds of things would you like to get a call about? What should people be aware of? What kinds of things might someone spot that you would say, well, yeah, give us a call. Let us check it out.
Well, I would like to encourage the public to feel comfortable calling the FBI, and to that end, we have done a lot of community outreach in our division and nationwide to help bridge into the communities and break down some of the mistrust, perhaps some misapprehension and misunderstandings about what the FBI is all about, what our investigative responsibilities and mission is. And to the extent that I think we've been successful in having that dialogue with the citizens that we serve, there are mechanisms for reporting things that look suspicious. We encourage the citizenry, the public, to make those types of reports. The tips and leads that come into us on a daily basis are investigated fully. Oftentimes those reports, those calls, those online reporting activities can be done anonymously. Of course, we would always like to be able to conduct the follow-up for additional information that might help us flesh out a complaint or conduct the investigation. But at the end of the day, it really is one of partnership with the citizens that we serve, the communities that we serve, and trying to break down those barriers as best we can.
And if someone gives you a piece of information, you check it out, there's nothing there, that's the end of it. The person who's called doesn't get in trouble or doesn't have to feel badly about it.
Absolutely. We would much prefer a citizen call us with a complaint, with a piece of information. We will run it to ground, we will vet it out, and if it turns out to be nothing at the end of the day, there is no backlash on the person who calls in to make that report. There is no information that is shared out as to who made the report. And we do that every day, and we do it quite effectively.
Do you have any data you can share with us on television about the number of arrests or the number of terrorist plots averted, or something that conveys to us how much is out there and how effective the FBI has been in keeping us safe?
I think one statistic that might resonate is that since 9/11, there have been over 400 convictions of offenses, terrorism-related offenses. So I think that from the standpoint of our investigations leading to convictions, we've been quite successful. In terms of the prevented acts, all I can say is that we've been equally successful in that regard as well.
John, how possible is it for somebody in a terrorist organization to defect from that organization? Does the organization come after them, and or is it if you want to defect, you defect and they leave you alone? I have no sense of that side of what happens to people when they decide to disassociate themselves from a cause they were part of earlier.
Well, I'm not quite sure about defection, but it is certainly possible to disengage and in some cases even leave. I was really genuinely surprised to find that people can and do leave terrorist movements all the time. Just as there is a steady stream of recruits coming in on one side, there is a steady stream of people who leave on the other. Generally speaking, people leave because they either have to or they want to. We've just finished 2 major studies on issues to do with disengagement and de-radicalization, and we've spent time interviewing former terrorists about their experiences. It's certainly a complex process. It is as gradual a process as that which helps us understand how and why people become involved in the first place. Some just can't take the pressures anymore. Some leave because they feel that the movement has gone too far in killing too many civilians, for example. Others we've interviewed have left because they feel that the movement hasn't gone far enough, that they haven't killed enough people. So there are multiple reasons at the individual, group, organizational level that relate to how and why people leave. We've just started to scratch the surface on it, but it clearly represents a very, very important topic for us to get a better handle on.
Last year, a Somali militia thought to have links to al-Qaeda produced a jihadi recruitment video that featured the son of a Syrian immigrant who was born in Alabama. What about the recruitment of Americans for terrorist organizations that have ties outside of the country? You both must see this from your different perspectives. U.S. citizens, but they're being connected to foreign organizations.
Well, I think, certainly on the surface, it really raises the prominence here of the power of the internet. I think, certainly for several years, we've assumed that the most significant point of concern about the internet when it comes to terrorism is the existence of terrorist websites. The kinds of ways in which terrorist movements use the internet for propaganda purposes. I think there is a much more complex issue going on here, and that is to do with how the nature of involvement, something I mentioned earlier on, is actually changing, and how individuals from, whether it's central Pennsylvania or Alabama or wherever, can be connected to individuals much further away. They can find a role for themselves, they can find a niche for themselves, and they can find ways to become much more significant in their eyes and to become part of something which is much bigger than them. And that's something that is actually a very, very powerful lure. It also is something that is very, very significant in terms of sustaining people's involvement. This notion of there being a virtual community that in the eyes of the believer is no less significant to being in a room much like we are now, speaking as we are.
Jan?
I would largely concur with Dr. Horgan about the value of the internet breaking down a lot of the barriers. It's much easier to get online and start to have that dialogue in some of these forums that allows you, initially at least, that anonymity to find that like kind out there and to start that dialogue. And to the extent that the internet now allows that to happen from the quiet of one's own home, certainly is I think, allowing much more of this type of activity to take place.
Speaking of the internet, the recent arrests in Ireland were linked to an alleged plot to kill a Swedish cartoonist who had put the head of the Prophet Muhammad on the body of a dog. There had been a bounty announced on some terrorist websites for those who might serve justice upon this cartoonist. So if al-Qaeda put a $100,000 bounty on him, how would a terrorist go about collecting something like that?
Well, not to suggest that any of your viewers or listeners are potential terrorists, but if I knew the answer to that, I'm not entirely sure I'd want to give it on your show. So, simple answer is I have no idea. A colleague of mine, in fact, likes to tell a story that she was doing research on the internet one evening, and she had been monitoring the activities of one particular group, and all of a sudden, a website pop-up window appeared on her screen, and it said, "Would you like to join the global Al-Qaeda movement? Click yes to continue." And she, I think, fortunately didn't. None of us really knew what would happen if she did, but it's not something any of us really want to try. So,
So I presume that the internet is both a research tool for special agents of the FBI and for our intelligence community, and is it an investigative tool for you? Do you often get led to email and the internet and people using the network more and more for terrorism-related activity?
The short answer is yes. Obviously, the internet, as I indicated, has broken down a lot of barriers. It's allowed global networking. And obviously we often get tips and leads that will lead us in the direction of the internet, as it is a very beneficial and useful tool. It's a wonderful creation. It also has a dark side to it.
Now, one country, I understand, Saudi Arabia, actually has a rehabilitation program for extremists to try to re-educate them and move them away from terrorism. Are you familiar with that? Can you tell us how it's working?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm intimately familiar with it. I had an amazing opportunity in March of last year to visit the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with a delegation of academics and some FBI officials. And we were given pretty unfettered access to the facilities that the Saudi Ministry of the Interior have there for attempting to rehabilitate jihadists and to try to reintegrate them back into community. Certainly from the Saudis' perspective, they would claim that this is a very successful program. They are right now quoting figures of about 80 to 90% success rate. I think there are some issues of concern around exactly what constitutes success. But certainly these kinds of programs represent a very new, innovative and creative approach to counterterrorism that should be encouraged. At some point there will need to be some kind of systematic evaluation to help us figure out if they represent something real going forward, but for now their development really should be encouraged.
Well, that music tells us that our time has flown by and we need to finish this discussion tonight. But I can't thank you enough both for being a part of it, really appreciate it, and between you, you've given us a tremendous amount of insight.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much.
So we want to thank tonight's guest, Janice Fedarcyk, Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Philadelphia Field Office, and John Horgan, Director of the International Center for the Study of Terrorism at Penn State. Thank you for watching. Tonight's program will be stored in an electronic archive that can be accessed through WPSU.org. This site also links to online resources on tonight's topic. To the Best of My Knowledge is a production of Penn State Public Broadcasting. For all of us here at WPSU, I'm Graham Spanier. Good night.
Presentation of To the Best of My Knowledge on WPSU is made possible in part by support from the Penn State Alumni Association, informing, involving, and inspiring Penn State alumni and students through its publications, programs, and events. On the web at alumni.psu.edu. And from the members of WPSU.